it's temperamental already.
Yeah. Let me introduce you. This is Rus Bradburd, and he's my guest this afternoon on the rebound. And we're going to get to ask him just right off the jump. We're going to ask him a question that everybody wants to know the answer to. Rus, why is it sometimes called a fiddle and other times it's called a violin?
Well, it's just the way that you play it. A fiddle player is playing a folk style, usually by ear, and a violin often refers to more classical music and classically trained players. So I'm definitely not a violinist.
Yeah, you're a fiddle player.
That's right, and proud of it. Also, violin players will brag about how much they paid for their violin, and fiddle players will brag about how little they paid for their fiddle.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, yeah, I got this for $12 at a garage sale. Well, that's a fiddle player.
Yeah. You love it? You love doing it?
I do. I've already played this morning, and I work on it every day, and it's just sort of my kind of my daily practice. I don't know if you'd call it like a Zen practice or something, but I do like it, and I've been doing it for many years. I've been doing it for nearly 30 years now. So
wow,
I'm not too bad at it.
Yeah. So getting to the basketball part of it, when were you at UTEP, and where were you before?
Well, I was a high school coach in Chicago and came to UTEP in 1983. And so I grew up in Chicago and graduated from college in 1980. I'm generally regarded, Doug, as the worst player in North Park College history, where I scored 13 career points. But I wanted to be a college coach, and I wrote letters to every Division I coach in America. And only 2 people responded. Judd Heathcote wrote me a personal letter back saying, hey, this is a well-written letter. I still have his response. This is a well-written letter, but you've got to personalize these if you're going to get ahead in the coaching business. But the other one was a phone call from Tim Floyd, who'd gotten a hold of the letter, and they were desperate. I think Tim was pretty desperate for help. It was a 3-person staff at that time: Don Haskins and the late Jim Forbes, who just passed away, and Tim Floyd. And so I think at that point, staffs were expanding, but UTEP's was not. And Tim was able to convince Don Haskins to take a chance on me. I was just 23 years old.
Well, you were there how long? 13, 14 years?
No, I was there 8 years. I was there 8 years, and they were 8 really great years. As I like to tell people, Doug, I had 8 great years at UTEP and 1 bad afternoon.
Yeah.
But we were winning, and we were winning big, and we had nice kids, and we had we were a national power every year. And so
who was playing then?
Well, when I first arrived, Tim Floyd had recruited virtually the entire team. It was Fred Reynolds and Wayne Soup Campbell and Luster Goodwin and Kent Lockhart, Dave Feidel, people like that. And then when Tim went off to Tim Floyd took the job at University of Idaho before he kind of worked his way up to New Orleans and Iowa State and then the Bulls, but and finally, of course, back to UTEP. But after Tim left in 1987, the complexion of the team started changing, and more of my Chicago kids started. Tim had done a great job in Los Angeles, but I always struck out in Los Angeles. I found it all very confusing, and you'd sit on the highway for hours at a time. But I had a good feel for Chicago. I knew the people, and I prided myself when I'd get off the airplane on a recruiting trip in Chicago. The Avis lady would say, "Do you want a map?" And I would say no. And I think I was probably one of the few people that didn't need a map to get around Chicago. I knew the city well enough that I could negotiate the whole thing without a map. So I was there so that's when the Chicago guys started getting more and more playing time. Besides Tim Hardaway, of course, Marlon Maxey and Johnny Melvin and Ralph Davis and kids like that.
Yeah. Where's Marlon Maxey these days? Do you know?
He's back in Chicago. He played 2 years, I think, with the Timberwolves, and then had a long career overseas. And I saw him I went to Ralph Davis's funeral about 14 months ago, and I saw him there, and he looks good. I remember him being a giant, thinking that he was 6'10", and he's, I don't know if he's shrunk. He's not any bigger than 6'7", but he had those giant hands. He had huge hands, and was a very effective player.
Yeah. What was it like to be an assistant to Coach Haskins?
Well, Coach Haskins, what really helped me with Don Haskins is I had Tim Floyd to explain him to me. And the way because if you didn't understand Coach Haskins, it could hurt your feeling. I don't think he spoke to me the entire first year. Well, maybe once or twice I'd go, pick up his shirts from the cleaners or get his Benson and Hedges lights. But Tim Floyd had warned me, he says he's not going to talk to you a lot. He's not going to encourage you. He's not a big first impression guy. He wants to know how you're going to do in the long run. And so he didn't pay much attention to me for a couple of years, but he also left you alone. He didn't bother you. He didn't lean over your shoulder and breathe down your neck. And I always thought that, I think it took him a few years to realize I was doing a pretty good job. And it took him several years to tell me that, but I had been warned by Tim Floyd, or I'd been prepped by Tim Floyd that, that he would say nice things about me to other people in town. And it would come back to me that, hey, Coach Haskins says you guys are doing a hell of a job. Well, he never told me that.
Yeah.
But but Tim Floyd had explained him to me, and I know we'd had assistant coaches that had come and gone fairly quickly that had a little trouble adapting to Coach Haskins, who would sort of leave you alone, but he wasn't going to give you, I never got a hug from Coach Haskins until he was retired.
Wow. Wow.
He wasn't a big hugger. He wasn't a big hugger even then, but yeah. So just understanding and that he was going to be, that he wasn't naturally optimistic and he wasn't naturally upbeat. He was gruff and to the point, and he expected you to do your job, and he treated you like a professional, but he wasn't gonna. I remember, for someone if I ever have to go to another academic meeting, it'll be too soon. We would meet once a year with Don Haskins. We'd have a staff meeting once a year.
Wow.
Can you imagine where, there's other staffs, I think, that meet every day, but also the danger of this is that if you weren't doing a good job for Coach Haskins, it would take him a couple of years to realize it because he wasn't breathing down your neck. But so in that way, he was great to work for. But thank goodness Tim Floyd had warned me, look, here's how he is, and don't take offense, and don't think anything of it. But, he wasn't gonna, he was an old school guy. And I think one of the things that was also sort of dictated the way he dealt with assistants is he'd never been an assistant coach at any level. And so I don't think he was that, fluent in dealing with assistants. He just sort of left you to your own devices and, and go do your job and get us some players and, make sure these guys are going to class and are they in the weight room and are they in the study hall and are they, paying attention during the film room and that kind of thing. But he wasn't breathing down. And, during the season, he'd show up an hour before practice. And then in the off season, he didn't show up much. So the good part about that, Doug, is that I got to learn every aspect of the business because he wasn't around. And so we had to sort of teach ourselves largely through Tim Floyd. There was scheduling for games, but also helping to schedule the players' academics, keep them on track to graduate, and summer camps and scouting and film and just all of the practice planning and all the little things that went with being a college coach. Because Don Haskins only coached practice in the games, it was left to us to do everything else.
Yeah. And where'd you go after UTEP?
Well, I lost my job in 1991 for giving players rides to their summer jobs, which there was never any question I was doing. It's legal now. It wasn't legal at the time, but Coach Haskins knew we were doing it and often told us to do it. And so, but lost my job in 1991 and went back to Chicago I worked at Moorhead. I loved El Paso and I couldn't bring myself to leave and wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. So I taught at Moorhead Junior High School for 1 year, and then got the idea to go back to Chicago where I grew up and went to college. To go back to Chicago, I went back to Chicago and started a scouting service. So I was going around watching kids play and writing about them. So it was when I taught myself to type, which at that time I didn't realize what an important skill that was going to be, for my next career. But I taught myself to type, and I went around to different practices and games every day, and really got to know the city. Then I knew it inside and out, and met a bunch more people. And so after 2 years of that, New Mexico State came around and offered me a job. So I was out of the business for 3 years and wasn't sure that I'd ever coach again, but joined New Mexico State in 1994.
And how long did you coach there?
Well, I was there 6 years, and by the time Lou Henson came, I was already sort of burned out, and I was taking classes from Robert Boswell, the fiction writer, and his wife Antonia Nelson. And so at New Mexico State, you could take a free class. So I signed up for the free class just about every semester and was taking. I'd met Robert Boswell, and he was a basketball fan, and started taking their graduate level classes. They let me sit in at first for no credit, and then I signed, taking the free class, and eventually applied for graduate school while I was still coaching. And so I got into the graduate program as a writer at New Mexico State while I was still coaching, and I was fading out. I just had enough. And one of the things for me, Doug, I'm a bit of a workaholic, and I'm a little bit OCD. And if I can, and I have trouble walking away from work, and I had trouble leaving at the end of the day. And so I'd be at the office for all hours and would have to but by the time I got to New Mexico State, in many ways, it was the same job as UTEP, as recruiting to an isolated place. It was the same kind of kids. We were going after transfers and junior college kids and overlooked players. So it was essentially the same job. And I think in retrospect, had I taken a high school job or a small college job, I maybe would have kept coaching. But I quit in 2000 to go to graduate school full time.
Yeah. And you figured that you finished your graduate degree?
I did. I got my MFA in creative writing with an emphasis on fiction. And then went to Ireland for a couple of years thinking that I would work on my book of fiction, but it was immediately such a weird place to be a basketball coach that I started keeping a diary, and that diary became my first book, Paddy on the Hardwood, where it's about coaching my team in Ireland into last place while I was learning the Irish fiddle. And so there was these interesting crossovers between. I just remember being at practice one day and telling my players, look, it's not your fault. You weren't raised in the tradition of basketball. You're going to have to take it slow, and it's going to take some time. And the next day, my fiddle teacher, in Ireland, told me the exact same thing. He says, it's not your fault, Russ. You weren't raised in the tradition. and I thought, well, this is weird. I've got to start writing this down. And that sort of diary became, it was sort of my journal, became Paddy on the Hardwood, my first book. And when I got back to New Mexico State, I was teaching just as an adjunct. But in academia, it's a funny system. If you have a book in academia, you're somebody special, and if you don't have a book, you're nobody. Now in basketball, we know that's not a good policy. Like Dennis Rodman was a great player, but it doesn't mean he'd be a great coach, right? Yeah. Or even Michael Jordan. Now, Rodman's an extreme example, of course, but even Michael Jordan, who's a great player, he's not going to be a great coach. And it's rare but in academia, if you have a book, so my book came out, and that led to promotions, and the timing of it was the timing was just right. And we had a president at the time that was promoting people that were writing, and the fact that I had a book, and then the Nolan Richardson book came out. And then one with Cinco Puntos Press, who just lost their publisher recently, Bobby Bird. He and his wife were the publishers of Cinco Puntos Press, Lee Bird. And, but each time I had a book came out, it would sort of indirectly lead to another promotion. And so I had very good timing and sort of landed on my feet and it became a professor at New Mexico State, which my friends back in Chicago still think is funny because I was a C student in college as a phys ed major. But even then, Doug, the truth is I was a phys ed major and I wasn't very good at it. Didn't do very well, but I was reading all the time then. I just majored in phys ed because I thought it would be easy, and it was relatively easy. But I was already reading all the time, and I was already doing a little bit of writing when I lived in El Paso.
Before we get to the Nolan book, tell me who your favorite 3 recruits were that came this way.
Well, everyone thinks, of course, it should be Tim Hardaway because he was far and away the best player, and I'm very proud of that. Although it wasn't I'm actually writing about Tim Hardaway for El Paso Matters, the great local website. I'm going to sort of make some confessions about the recruiting of Tim Hardaway. And so, of course, I'm very proud of him. But the one who really sticks out in my mind is Johnny Melvin. And because Johnny Melvin, who still lives in El Paso, and some people are aware that his son played at El Paso High for a couple of years, but Johnny came from really, really rough circumstances with broken glass, no lights in the hallway, no lock on the outside door, in a really, really rough and tumble neighborhood, raised by a single mother. And, was just, Englewood is without question the worst single neighborhood in Chicago. And he came out of Englewood with a bunch of problems. But at UTEP, he never caused any problems. And he was, pretty much a 4-year starter, and he's still in the top 20 in career scoring, and he's in the top 20 in assists and steals and rebounds. And so for a guy who came from that background to overcome what he had, now he never did get his degree, but he's become, he's a fine person. The other one that comes to mind was a young man named Eric Channing, who had to decide, do I want to go to Wheaton College, or should I take this scholarship offer from New Mexico State? And so we took him at New Mexico State, and the timing there was perfect because he was a great shooter. And Lou Henson, we all know, was a great coach, but Lou was a really great coach for shooters. And so Lou ran a lot of plays for Eric Channing, and he wound up he's still the career leading scorer for New Mexico State. So I was very lucky that, Tim Hardaway at one time was the leading scorer in UTEP history. And then Antoine Gillespie, who I recruited, broke Hardaway's record. And Eric Channing is still now someone who has broken Gillespie's record. But at one time I could say that I suppose I could still say it. I was lucky enough to recruit 3 career leading scorers at 2 schools.
Yeah.
So, but those guys, Channing he was a religious kid, and he went to seminary and he's now the campus pastor at Wheaton College, where he almost went to school himself. He has a son named Lou, who was born on Lou Henson's birthday. They're from 2 very different backgrounds, but those are the ones that sort of come to mind off the top of my head.
Yeah. How did Nolan's book come to be?
Well, I knew a man named Rocky Galarza, the great boxing trainer in El Paso, and he was from the Segundo Barrio, and he got me indirectly. Rocky got me started doing with Steve Yellen, doing basketball in the Barrio that we've done now for 30 years. Well, one day in basketball in the Barrio, Nolan Richardson showed up, and he said, "Hey, can I talk? I'd like to talk to the kids if it's okay." And I said, "Listen, coach, I knew where this was headed. These head Division I coaches, they want a lot of money to speak. They generally are making upwards of $5,000 to give a talk." I said, "Coach, we're all volunteers. We charge these kids $1." "Oh, I know, they all pay $1." He said, I don't want any money. I just want to talk to the kids." And I don't know if you've ever heard Nolan Richardson speak. He's the best public speaker that ever lived. He's a great, you'd run through a wall for him when he's done speaking.
Russ, everybody I've talked to has been okay. The only person that intimidated me was Nolan.
Oh, well, he can be an intimidating person. But so afterwards, I had already written my first book, and I said to him, I came to him and said, "Listen, I'd like to write the book about you." But I told him, "I don't think you're like Lute Olson or Jim Calhoun or Rick Pitino. That those guys are all good coaches, but what I convinced him of is that his place in history as an icon of the civil rights movement." And so I said, "You're like closer to Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell than you are to Lute Olson and Rick Pitino and Jim Calhoun." And he bought into that. And if you read that book, the Nolan Richardson book called 40 Minutes of Hell, there's about 5 pages of basketball in there. And the rest is about the people and his journey and the struggles and those kinds of things. So Nolan can be a difficult guy. What made Nolan a great, great coach was that he's, a powerful, strong, powerful and strong and forthright person. And he's going to do things on his own terms. And so I know that his assistant coach told me once that when he would go to see a recruit, he would sit in the stands and the assistant coach would bring the recruit to Nolan, that there was a certain power dynamic there, that he was going to control the nature of the conversation, and we're going to have the conversation where I want to have it. And here's where I am right now. And so I think with Nolan, he was really, really shrewd psychologically. He's the smartest person I've ever met in terms of dealing with human nature and understanding how kids think. Which, some people think that, geez, it's so complicated, these 10 X's and O's. And the thing that Nolan taught me is, yeah, 10 X's and O's can be complicated, but 12 teenage minds are a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
So to deal with the mentality of a team full of 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds and be able to reach them and convince them and get them to buy in, that's a really difficult thing to do. And I'll give you an example of how difficult it is nowadays, the world has changed now, where the teams are changing, walking away, there's with the transfer portal and those kinds of things. There's where Nolan, I think, was very effective is he was able to get the kids to buy in and be fully committed.
Yeah,
and I think it's getting harder and harder to do that now.
Yeah. Nolan told me that collegiate basketball today is minor leagues for the NBA.
Yeah. I think there's an element of truth to that. But Nolan was a troublemaker. If he saw injustice or things that he thought were unethical or not right, he spoke up about it. He wasn't, I think he was in some ways he was very much like Don Haskins, but Don Haskins didn't make waves. He didn't make enemies around campus, and Haskins might grumble and say, "Oh, that son of a bitch." But when he saw him, he would be kind and gracious, and he wasn't going around making enemies. But Nolan was much more direct and said what he thought, and he was going to speak up if he thought that something was unjust.
Yeah. Why do you think Nolan never came here and coached?
They didn't ask him.
Just that simple?
Yeah, I mean, they had a chance to hire him. They had a chance to hire him several times, and they never asked him. I think it would have been a great thing to do, and to look. I mean, I think UTEP is in good hands. I'm a fan of Joe Golding. He seems like a really good guy and a really good coach. But if that it would have been hard to. So I'm not suggesting they replaced Joe Golding with Nolan, who's now. Let me think. Nolan would be 81 years old, but there was a time when he was young enough to do it, and he's got big energy levels, and they never asked him. It's one of the things that I found perplexing about UTEP is that, yes, Don Haskins broke the color barrier, but it wasn't until many years later when they hired Tony Barbie that they broke the color barrier in coaching. I mean, how many football coaches have they had since 1966?
Yeah.
I mean, you'd think accidentally they'd hire a guy of color without, oh my God, we've hired a black guy. We weren't even aware we did it. But just percentage wise, it starts to feel deliberate. And so one of the things I learned from Nolan is that things aren't, it's great to put black players out on the court. That's great. Let's put the most qualified players out there. But until there's people of color in leadership positions, not that much has changed. And so while Don Haskins was a great, great pioneer, I feel like it's fallen onto UTEP to take the next steps in his legacy. When Haskins won the national championship in 1966, there'd never been an African-American professor. Well, that's appalling to me. And I'm not the only one. And so I think we're all still trying. I remember a few years ago at New Mexico State, we had a black athletic director, a black head basketball coach, and a black football coach. And that's not the only reason we should be hiring people based on their skin color. But but the truth is that there must have been a qualified African-American football coach at some point along the way for UTEP. And so where I would take issue with people in leadership positions is we can't just have black players. That doesn't, and also one of the things I learned from Nolan is desegregating is not the same as integrating. And so,
what's the difference?
Well, desegregating means you've got one black guy.
Yeah.
Integrating is something that's more, would be a little more reflective, and so I do think one of the things, in writing the Nolan Richardson book, I was able to see, how difficult it was for these guys to get their start in coaching. And so one of the things, it's a hard thing to think about. Well, when Don Haskins won the national championship in 1966, there was no black coach. There were no black coaches in America in major college basketball. There were no black coaches until 1970. And so all of the icons of college basketball, the guys with the tons of wins, from John Wooden to Adolph Rupp to Don Haskins to Bobby Knight, all these guys got their start in a segregated era. And so, oftentimes when you see these lists of the best coaches ever, well, it's hard to accumulate wins. John Wooden didn't coach against a black coach until near the end of his career.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I believe, Doug, is that we were cheated out of some of the greatest games that we're never able to, like we never got to see Satchel Paige against Babe Ruth. Not that I was around to see it,
Right.
but we never got to see John McClendon, the great coach, against Dean Smith. And we never got to see Clarence Big House Gaines against Mike Krzyzewski. We were sort of cheated out of those. And so while sports is often at the forefront of social change, it's not perfect. It's sports is nearly always ahead of the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean that there's not adjustments that have to be made. And so I'm not advocating for hiring people only on the basis of the color of their skin. I was appalled when Joe Biden said, I'm going to hire a black woman to be vice president. I thought he should say, I'm going to hire the most qualified person. And if it happens to be Kamala Harris, great, let's do it. But I'm not suggesting we start naming, let's hire black people. I'm saying, let's hire people regardless. And, but Don Haskins and Nolan Richardson were very different in that regard, where Don Haskins was completely colorblind. And Nolan was obsessed with, and I think still is, when are things going to be equal for us? And so I think between them, and with a blend of their philosophies, I think we're sort of able to figure things out and move forward. And so I've thought for quite a while, what Haskins did at UTEP and what Lou Henson did. Lou single-handedly desegregated Hardin Simmons when he went there. That was all great, but we've got the university has to follow that lead and put people in leadership positions.
Yeah.
Just my opinion, Doug.
Yeah. So what do you think? How hard would it be to recruit or coach today with the transfer portal? Seems like a good kid gets pissed off and he's gone.
I don't know. It seems, yes. And this is the biggest weapon in recruiting now I'm holding in my hands. Was probably the last coach in America not to have a cell phone. So I retired from college coaching in 2000 and I never had a cell phone. And so I just, I'd stop at the side of the road and put quarters into the phone and into the pay phone. But I can't imagine, because I think we're sending the wrong message to kids. I think sports should be about sustained effort, sustained attention, sustained loyalty. And when a kid can just jump from school to school, and I don't think we're teaching them anything. So a good example is Tim Hardaway, who's going into the Hall of Fame in 2 weeks. I think he started 5 games as a freshman, averaged about 4 points a game, put up 3 3-pointers. Well, no, there were no 3-pointers then. He only put 12 up as a sophomore. But Tim Hardaway in today's world wouldn't have stayed. He would have bounced around. I just don't think we're if my wife burns dinner, I don't throw her out for that mistake, right? You have to learn. You have to learn to live with imperfections, learn to struggle. I think the entire purpose of sports is, what are we going to do when things go badly? That's the only thing to learn from sports. I think the only real thing. Everyone's good when you win. Yes, I won. But when things go badly, what are you going to do? Are you going to lay on the canvas and not get back up? Or are you going to just give up and not fight in the second half? And are you going to, just because you've lost 4 in a row, are you going to throw in the towel and lose the rest of them? And so I think the main purpose of sports is to teach people what to do when things go badly. When things go well, everybody's good at that. Everybody's good at cutting down the nets and celebrating. There's no one who you'd ever say, God, he just wasn't very good at celebrating after that big win. It's what I fear we're teaching young people is, if you're not happy with how things are, walk away. And there is a time to walk away. I'll never be an NBA player. It's time for me to give up the dream I had when I was 14, right? And there's time for me. I'll never be an NBA or a college head coach. There's times when it's best to give up the dream. But what we're doing now is we're teaching kids to quit if you don't like it. And that's not a good thing to do. And I do think the one exception I would make is if the head coach leaves, then maybe, because most kids choose their school largely based on the head coach. And I think if the head coach leaves, then we should allow kids into the transfer portal. But to make it into this kind of meat market kind of work, and it makes it difficult for the fans to follow the game. I remember when we were kids, Doug. I remember once when we were kids, we weren't kids together, but you probably remember this instance. We were playing baseball at the park, and somebody came in and said, "They've traded Willie Mays." We were like, "What? They didn't trade?" "Yes, I just heard it on the radio. They traded." It was just astounding. Well, now flash forward to the Toronto Raptors. Well, I think that guy Nick Nurse is a great, great coach, and he had Kawhi Leonard as a free agent, and they win the championship. And I said to the guy I was watching the game with, I said, "Well, it's over with now. Kawhi Leonard will never leave Toronto now. He just won their first championship. They'll probably make him mayor of Toronto." He was gone the next day.
Yeah.
And I think that the way the world is now, it makes it, I think it's difficult to teach kids because everything is instantly available on the phone. You go through the drive-through and there's your delicious meal. And, you go through your drive-through and there's your delicious meal in 60 seconds. And we want things and we want it right now. But I think that if you're ever going to be a great writer or a great fiddle player or a great dribbler or a great, great piano player or whatever, it's going to take years and years and years of effort. And what I worry about is that we're actually teaching kids the opposite, that if you're not happy with how things are, you can leave, you can go complain, you can switch classes, but I think there's something to be said for, fighting through things.
Well, look at the NBA today. I mean, can you imagine Jerry West wearing a Celtic uniform to get a ring?
It makes me dizzy just to think of it. But yeah, I don't think it's good for basketball. Now, the one thing that I think sometimes it swings back and forth. Like, at one point the players couldn't leave and they were stuck, and they were, until Kurt Flood came along, you couldn't become a free agent. So in a way that in many ways, I think that's been great for the players. But there's something now about, well, I just saw that, I can't think of the baseball player's name, but he's on the Dodgers now, and he went back to Atlanta.
Yeah.
And he got very weepy when they gave him his championship ring or gave him that kind of, but the reason he left Atlanta is he was making $100 million in Atlanta, but the Dodgers offered him $140 million. And Atlanta I mean, if that's what it's come to, I think
how much is enough?
Yeah, I think, yes. I think we're lost in, and this is from a guy that I've never worried about. My average salary, you'll be stunned, Doug. When I was at UTEP, we went to 7 NCAA tournaments and we were ranked in the top 20 nearly every year. And my average salary was $17,000.
Wow.
And it never bothered me. I was just, I just thought I would have liked to made more, but I was working for Don Haskins and I loved El Paso and the miners are going to be good. And I'd never applied for another job. In today, now I know how foolish that was. I probably should have left after 4 years or 3 years, or once Tim Hardaway became a star, I could have sort of ridden that to a higher salary. But I do think that I just know that the reasons I got into coaching were that I loved kids and I loved the game. But what I found, what I always struggled with after that is, well, why am I staying in coaching? And when it becomes about the money, then I don't know, you might as well be like Steve Yellen and be a great stockbroker, or be like Tom Speasney, be a great lawyer, or like Jim Bowden, be a great dentist. If it's only about the money, I don't understand the point of sticking around the game.
I hadn't heard Tom's name in a long time.
Well, he's the great labor lawyer, thinker. I haven't made an important decision in the last 20 years that I didn't call him right before and say, "Tom, here's what's going on." And I just think he has uncommon common sense.
Yeah. So I'm watching a show right now about the Lakers on Hulu, and it's the real Lakers. It's not a bunch of actors. And Magic is pissed off and he wants a trade. So Jerry Buss comes in and gives him a 25-year, $25 million contract. And the whole world shook at how much money it was. And 2 days ago, LeBron signs 2 years for $97 million.
Wow.
Just shows you where it's gone.
Yeah. I'm all for paying but there's, there's good and bad with everything. And the fact that the prices are so high. Well, like, for example, now I was going to go to a baseball game this summer at Wrigley Field, and it was raining, so I didn't go, but bleacher seats were $70.
Yeah.
And so now, what you've done is you've made it impossible. So this goes back to why Steve Yellen and I started basketball in the barrio is, that if you want to go to a Division I basketball camp, now UTEP's, when Don Haskins did it, was fairly reasonable. I'm assuming that Joe Golding's camp is affordable as well. But if you want to go to, say, if you want to go to the University of Texas basketball camp, I'll bet it's $500 now.
At least.
El Paso kids don't have $500. And so,
But you've taken me to my Chihuahuas argument. I mean, the average family in El Paso, husband and wife and 2 kids, first you got to buy the tickets and you got to drive down, spend the gas, and you got to find a place to park. Then you go in, the kids want a hot dog and a Coke. Dad has a couple beers, mom has something, they get a souvenir. It's $300.
yes, and that's minor league baseball.
Yeah. I mean, how can it happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're pricing people out. I think that UTEP and New Mexico State home basketball games are still fairly affordable.
They are.
Yeah. But I mean, you'd think I would know that, but because I've been doing the TV and I'll be doing the radio this year, I haven't had to buy a ticket for a little while. Thanks to Mario Moccia and the,
Which radio are you doing?
I'm going to be with Jack Nixon on the he'll do the play-by-play, and then I'll tell him what he got wrong.
Oh,
So
yeah?
I'll be the color analyst for Aggie radio this year, but I'd done TV on and off for a few years with Adam Young.
Do you have to do it in person, or can you do it?
Well, that's a good question. Yes, you do. And in fact, last year, right before I went to Ireland, I'd been very careful about COVID because my wife I was a little paranoid because I'm in my 60s now, but my wife was even more paranoid. So I hardly even left the house. And then I thought the Aggie game started and they want me to, it was the UTEP game. And I went and did the game. And 2 days later, boy, I was wrecked. So
Wow.
I sort of gave it up for the team, but no, I've got to do it in person.
Yeah. You and I talked about Ireland at James Kennedy had a party for his wife. Do you know them, James and Josie Kennedy?
I know him to see him. I can't picture him in my head.
It was at Artavino's.
All
and,
right.
And my wife had just gotten back from riding horses in Ireland.
Yes, I remember that.
And you and her had the big chat about Ireland.
Yeah.
But, that was the last time.
Kennedy's a very in County Cork in particular, and I think Waterford. There's plenty of Kennedys around there. Yeah, we were just. I was over and I'm got to work on a new book, and I was living in Belfast in Northern Ireland for 6 months, and so I love Ireland, as you might know. I've been over there, lived over there a few times on and off, and we think about retiring, but then you get back for the winter here in New Mexico or El Paso, and it seems like it'd be crazy not to be here in the winters.
Yeah. What is your last book? Your most current book?
Well, the most current one, well, after the Nolan Richardson book was a book of fiction that Bobby Bird and Lee Bird published at Cinco Puntos Press called Make It, Take It. It's sort of a novel in stories. And then I wrote a book called All the Dreams We've Dreamed. It's about the gun violence survivor named Sean Harrington, who played for the
I've read a lot about it.
Yeah, so just a very dramatic story. But what I'm working, I've got a novel floating out there with my agent. Who knows whether anyone would ever take that, but I'm working on a book now, Doug, about Syrian refugees in Belfast and how they're assimilating. It sounds more academic than what it is, but these Syrian refugees are coming to Ireland and the parents are sticking their kids into Gaelic football in the same way that if they came here, they'd stick them into little league baseball or basketball or whatever. So I like the idea of as we've discussed, I like the idea of sports as sort of this bridge between people. I know it's happened with so many of us that it brought people of different colors and different backgrounds together in a way that it just would not have happened if it wasn't for basketball. And so I've seen this happening now in Belfast, where these refugee families, they're sticking their, I'm not talking about the good players, I'm just talking about children, that they're sticking kids into these youth programs playing Gaelic football, which is a strange and unusual game that's it's played a few places in the world, but mostly it's only played in Ireland.
Yeah. So when are you going back?
Well, not soon enough. I really, as a fiddle player, I really love Ireland. I'm hoping to go this spring or this summer, but I'm taking the year off of teaching to work on this new book, and so I'm taking time off from typing because I needed a break, and I'd rather talk to you anyway.
So is writing as an author, is that your passion? Is that your number one deal?
It is, but there's interesting similarities, Doug. You wouldn't think that writing and basketball are alike, But the way writers work, or the way I was taught to work by Robert Boswell and Antonia Nelson, is that you work on your stuff really hard, and then you show it to 3 or 4 people, and then they tell you it sucks, and and then you go back and work on it by yourself. Well, that's what happens in basketball. You're out playing by yourself in your driveway or at the park. Then you get with the group and you realize you're the only guy out there who can't make a lefty layup or whatever, or you're the only guy who can't make threes. And you go back and work on your game, and then you come back to the group. Then you go work on. So there's an aloneness that I think, in retrospect, looking back on I was a terrible player, but as a Division III walk-on, but in retrospect, the thing I liked about basketball was the aloneness of it. Is that, yeah, it was great to meet people and have friends and be one of the boys, but it was also something you could do by yourself, like going to play baseball by yourself or football by yourself. But basketball is, I think, probably the best sport ever invented for going maybe other than running, but the best team sport ever for going and working on your skills by yourself. I always liked that. And I liked it as a coach. I liked getting a guy alone and working with him on his dribbling skills or his shooting skills. And so there's and there's even similarities between the writing or the fiddling and basketball. Same thing happens in fiddling, where in Ireland, you get to go to these sessions and there's a group of musicians sitting around, and you realize, I'm the only one who doesn't know that tune. I'm going to go home and practice that. And so that idea of working alone and then coming back and then working alone. And one of the advantage, I didn't know it at the time, Doug, but one of the great things about being such a terrible player, and I think Steve Yellen would agree with this, he was a terrible player at UTEP, is there's something about the struggle that actually prepares you well for life. Like, I always wish that I was 6'11" and then I maybe could have played in the NBA or whatever. But the truth is that there's a real value, as we talked before, in the sustained struggle. That's the real value. Is it taught me as a writer, there's constant rejections from editors or that kind of thing, and there's a constant dismissal of your work. You get ignored. Well, that basketball was a good preparation for that. Like, getting fired by UTEP, getting cut my senior year of college, all of those things were in a way, and the struggle of practicing my left hand over and over and over again. Well, because much of writing is just grunt work. You just go back and edit it. It's not like I get brilliant ideas and they just blossom. I just keep plugging away at it and print it, read it, mark it up with a red pen, hang my head in frustration, and then go back to it. Well, that was how my basketball career went. Yeah. And it's actually how most people's basketball. Most people are not Michael Jordan. Most people do struggle, and it doesn't come easy to them. And there's a value to that. And so it's I think we've done a good job with my daughter. She's a nice kid, but one of my few regrets is we didn't make her play team sports, and we should have made her do it. I just figured, I'm already making her play the fiddle, but there's something about struggling and being part of a team that's really that's good for people. And I'll go back and say it again, letting people transfer immediately. And when you're not happy with the way things are, I just wonder about the value of what that's teaching people.
Yeah. I played at Eastwood with Crenshaw and
I knew it.
Jim guys, and we won state. And my senior year we lost, but we made it pretty far. And Haskins gave us all a walk-on tryout. And I thought, hey, I'm walking on. Holy cow, was I out of place? Yeah. When you get there, everybody can do it.
Well, and he was a difficult guy to be a walk-on for. So in a way, you're probably lucky. Like I'm trying to think of Merle Heimer and David Dick and some of the guys that we had that were walk-ons. When I say that he was hard to be a walk-on for us, he didn't take it easy on you because you were a walk-on.
No, it was hell.
Okay, can you imagine being like Merle Heimer and guarding Greg Foster during practice?
No.
And then just getting blistered by Coach Haskins for not doing a better job of blocking out the 7-footer or whatever. Yeah. And so Haskins was a difficult guy to be a walk-on for. So I will tell you, Doug, it would probably have been very traumatic had you made it. So
I look at what happened to Jim Bowden. I mean, first team All-State as a senior, and not much of a career at UTEP.
Yeah. Well, that was right before I came. So I know Jim a little bit, although if it was up to people like me, Jim Bowden wouldn't have a job. I've never had a cavity.
Really?
Yes. Never had a cavity.
Wow.
but I mentioned making difficult decisions, and one of the things that Don Haskins would do is whenever we had a difficult decision, not a basketball decision, but a decision on whether to give this guy a scholarship or whether to, any kind of bigger picture thing, we always called in Jim Bowden Sr., the father. He'd have his cowboy hat on, he'd sort of thumb his cowboy hat up, and Coach Haskins would ask him to run everything by him, and he would sit and think for a few minutes, and we all sort of sat on the edge of our seat. But I think Mr. Bowden, we called him Mr. Bowden, and he had great wisdom.
He did. I remember.
Yes. And so, yeah, but it's tough. Is you can be a high school superstar and sit on the bench in college.
Yeah. I guess the kid that did the best out of Eastwood was Terry White.
Yes, and I knew Terry a little bit, but he was done playing before I got there, and he wasn't in town quite as much as, I think Jim Bowden and Tim Crenshaw never left town.
No, they never did.
Yeah, those guys remained in town, but also I know they weren't very good then. But Coach Haskins talked about those years; those were his 3 worst years. I like to blame Steve Yellen, but he did talk about how that team, they actually did overachieve, and he got them to play together and play hard. And those were sort of the buildings blocks for the great teams in the '80s, were the Terry White teams were, and they started to get a little bit better, and then things exploded in the 1980s.
Yeah. So what's on your agenda?
What you mean for the rest of the day? I've got to go pick my daughter up from school, but I've got the year off. I'm working on this new book idea. I've got the Aggie radio stuff with Jack Nixon coming up. We just finished our 30th year of basketball in the barrio.
How did it go?
Well, it was great, and Steve Yellen and I get all the credit for it. But there's a whole army of not army, but there's a half dozen or 6 or 10 people that have Tracy Yellen for one. But then we have there's Elena Hernandez and LaCroix Rhines and Sochi Rodriguez and Laura Ntibbe and all these people that have been with me for years that I can and we had brought a guy out from LA named Mark Moses came out and did the music station. And so what I've become better at, I used to be terrible at it, Doug, is I delegate to these people now. Like, you do whatever you want at the music, do whatever you want for the dance. When the folklorico dancers come, do whatever you want. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is, I've been doing it for 30 years. And did you notice that Pete Carrill just died? The Prince. Well, the best piece I read about him, talked about after he died, was that his favorite game of all time was he got kicked out of the game early in the game, and there was no other coach. It was back when you only traveled with one coach, and he had a walk-on coach the team. When he got kicked out, he was in the locker room, and they won the game anyway. And he said what he felt like was it was really important for like you learn from the teacher, and then you go on and do it without the teacher. You don't need the teacher to hold your hand. And what I'm trying, Steve Yellen and our goal for basketball in the barrio is that, we can't do it forever, but we don't want that. We want the camp to keep going. And so we've got LaCroix Rhines, and I remember Isaiah Rhines, who was, a backup center for the Miners. They do the education station, and Elena Hernandez brings all the artists and the musicians in. And we've got this whole sort of slew of people who've been helping with it. And my idea is to dump it on them in a few years and let them, but I know Steve feels the same way. It's our pride and joy. We like doing it. But the other thing, I think it's always important to say this: there are people who have dedicated their lives to Segundo Barrio,
right?
Whether they're writers like David Romo or Simon, the guy who does the football, they call it football club, the soccer team in Segundo Barrio, people who work at La Fe, the people who teach at Aoe or Guillen Middle School or Booyah. There's people who have dedicated their lives to helping these kids. I go there for 3 days. And I think it's important what we do. I think it's good what we do, but it's not as important as what the teachers are doing at Bowie High School.
Right.
And so I don't like to get too, I don't want to, as Coach Haskins used to call it, chesty, if you got a big ego, because I think what we're doing is good and fun. And I do it to remember, I do it to remember Rocky Galarza, my old friend, the boxing trainer, but I don't think it's any earth-shattering thing. I think it's one small thing amongst a lot of great things that are going on in Segundo.
Rocky's, they got that painting of Rocky on the side of that building in downtown.
Yes, the Boxing Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Yes.
That building burned down, and I'm wondering what they're going to do about that wall.
I didn't know that. I did
Yeah,
not
it
know
was
that.
called the DeSoto Hotel.
What happened?
It just burned up.
When
Yeah.
was it still it was no longer a working hotel, was it?
It was in the process of being renovated. Yeah.
Well,
But I'm wondering what they're going to do with that wall. I hope they don't tear it down. It's still standing for a reason.
well, El Paso has a great boxing tradition, you know, from with Juan Lascano and Rocky Galarza and Herman Delgado and people like that. There's been great fighters come out of El Paso. Geez, I didn't know that. Well, tell Steve Yellen. He'll get it sorted out. The mural will be back up tomorrow.
There you go. Steve's tough, isn't he?
No, well, one of the things I've learned a lot from Lou Henson, and one of the things I learned from Lou Henson is very much what I've learned from Steve Yellen is he's unflappably happy. Like he's upbeat. He's not, no matter when you call Steve, he never says, "Oh, I had that son of a bitch on the phone. I wish I could I would like to strangle that guy." Steve would never say anything like that.
Never.
His first impulse is to be positive and upbeat. And I'll also say this, Doug, is at the lowest time in my life, my fiance had left me and I got fired at UTEP, and I felt like I had no other than Joe Gomez. I felt like I had no friends, and Joe Gomez and Tom Speasney, but Steve Yellen let me stay on his couch, and I stayed on his couch for months till I was able to sort of get back on my feet. And when you're rock bottom, Steve Yellen is going to be there for you.
Or Joe Gomez.
You look like you're about to hit rock bottom, Doug. So if you might get Yellen's, I'm teasing you, but I would say, you know, can we just give out his phone number on the air here?
Why not?
No, we better not.
But Joe Gomez is another one. You talk about a guy.
Yes,
Joe's a guy.
Well, when Joe's, you know, I always have to say this is that by joke, but I'm only half kidding, is that Coach Haskins would have thought he came in second in 1966 if it wasn't for Joe Gomez. Joe was the one. Joe was always pushing to get those guys recognized. Big Daddy Latin and Bobby Joe Hill and Willie Cager. It was Joe Gomez who spearheaded we got to get these guys. Can you believe? But they didn't get their championship rings until 1986.
Yeah, Joe had to do it.
Yeah, and that was all Joe Gomez, and he was often the Lone Ranger on this stuff. It wasn't until recently that Joe was started to be appreciated by UTEP people. But I remember when I got fired at UTEP, like you sort of become, you kind of, part of it I'm sure was in my imagination. You feel like you're a persona non grata, that you know that no one like you know, it seemed like every time the phone rang, it was Joe Gomez or Tom Speasney or Yellen checking on me, you know. And so you find out who, you know, not that El Paso was always great to me, but at the time that I was lowest in my life, those guys were really great friends to me.
Yeah, Joe's a great friend of mine. Another one is Beto Fournier.
Yeah, I don't know Beto as well, but
Beto credits you with starting the mini dribblers.
Well, yes, I did.
And his son was one of the inaugural mini dribblers. Diego.
What was the kid's name back?
Diego.
Oh yes, of course. Well, yeah, you should have just said Diego's dad. But yeah, in 1984, I got this idea to have a halftime dribbling team, and we called them the Minor Mites. And a man named Ted Houghton, who I think is still in El Paso.
Ted's still around.
Ted was able to get us, he got the M Bank to sponsor us. We were the M Bank Minor Mites. And it was really exciting because, you know, the kids they were out doing their dribbling shows at halftime and they were getting standing ovations. And, you know, it was Bobby Deibler's son and Kenny John's son and Hank Felix's son, you know, a lot of great local coaches. But there was an interesting mix of kids. There were boosters kids, but they were also poor kids. And it was a strange mix of kids, and there were boys and girls. And I remember, you know, Coach Haskins would say, "Now, Russ, God damn it, go see how much time is left on the clock at halftime." And I would go, I knew the Minor Mites were performing, and I'd go out there and stand there for an extra minute or two and watch our kids perform. And it just gave me chills. And then run back up and say, "Coach, there's only 2 minutes to go. We've got to get out there." But I was always sort of spying on the Minor Mites from this, you know, from up in the tunnel, because I didn't coach them once the show started. And they were sort of on automatic pilot, or my roommate Pancho coached them. But yeah, I loved it. And we got, you know, it's always been a free program. And I did the same thing up here in New Mexico. They were called the Pistoleros.
Yeah.
And they went until about 4 or 5 years ago, when my daughter turned 10, I thought it was getting harder and harder to get the gym. You know, one of the things, Doug, when I was coaching, I could get the gym whenever I wanted. And then as I became an English teacher, it got harder and harder to get the gym and reserve the gym. And just, it was almost like I'd forgotten what I'd forgotten what I'd known about basketball because I was an English teacher. And so I sort of retired from doing the dribbling teams I guess in 2000 and I don't know, let me think, 2015, I guess I retired from doing the mini dribblers, but it's been a great thing to do is, teaching kids dribbling skills and getting to know, give them confidence at that age, I think is a good thing to do.
Were you around here at all when my high school coach was coaching, Bobby Leslie?
I did. And I can remember the first time I met him, I went to see him and I was supposed to try and get him to send his kids to summer camp. And Coach Haskins didn't explain to me what a complicated relationship he had with Bobby, that they had a real, they really loved and respected each other, but they'd grumble about each other. They were like, brothers that were rivals. And I remember Bobby was smoking in his office back then. They weren't as concerned about smoking in his office. And he said, that son of a bitch Haskins, I love the man. He would call him a son of a bitch on the one hand, and then say, I love him. And I just thought, well, this is an interesting relationship that Bobby led, but he was a great, great coach and different than, I think a lot of those guys that played for Coach Haskins and had to play so slow, like Nolan Richardson and Bobby, they became great offensive coaches as sort of a rebellion against, because I thought Bobby Leslie was a great offensive coach.
He was.
No.
We ran his own offense.
Yes, that he was a real innovator and a visionary offensively, which no one ever accused Don Haskins of being a visionary offensively.
David Lattin told me the other day that it was 2 hours and 45 minutes of practice and 15 was spent on offense.
Yes, that sounds about right. And in fact, when Coach Haskins was working on the offense, you could feel him sort of shifting to the defense and start chastising the defense for letting them ever score. And it was just, the message became clear to the players. Defense is more important.
Yeah.
And so the message we send to kids, like I try and do it now with my daughter, like everybody, I'm on my phone, but when my daughter comes in, I try and ditch the phone and give her the message we send, as adults, kids are not dummies. And
they're not,
and so with Coach Haskins, the message was always, defense is more important.
Yeah, it was. And he.
Doug, I lost you. You lost your audio there just for 3 seconds.
Yeah. I think we've covered it all.
Go. Well, great. Well, let me know when it comes out and then put it on my Facebook page or Twitter or whatever. I'll blast it around.
I appreciate it. Thanks again, huh?
Good, Doug. Yeah, I'll see you in person sometime, but
yeah.
And if I have ideas on who would be good for the podcast, I'd have to think, but I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Bye, Russ.
All right. Thanks a million.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.